Lord Monckton, thank you so much for taking the trouble to join us today. Once again, I really appreciate your time to shed some light on what I consider to be a very, very important issue. You've done some work previously on exposing the climate models as being effectively useless in their calculations. Perhaps we can just give us a brief synopsis of that. But the climate prediction models, it seems they're once again being used to justify and indeed accelerate the pace of action towards addressing this bogus climate change. And on the BBC News this morning, in fact, they were citing the climate models as saying that the emperor penguins are going to be dying out in Antarctic because they're running out of sea ice. But perhaps you can expand a little bit on the fact that these climate models just don't work. As far as I understand, they haven't actually historically predicted anything accurately. Are we right in that?
That's right. Let's begin with the penguins. Until 2 years ago, throughout the 35 years during which we've been able to monitor the sea ice in Antarctica, it was actually growing, and growing more or less continuously. And then in the last 2 years, there's been a sudden precipitate decline for reasons which are not at all well understood and are very unlikely to have anything to do with global warming, because we're adding a certain amount of CO2 each year. And so you wouldn't expect to get a sudden change in the ice in Antarctica caused by us. Clearly what's happening is something to do with possibly subsea volcanic activity, which has caused enormous volatility both in Antarctica, particularly West Antarctica, and in Greenland. And as you know, there are 3.5 million subsea volcanoes, and we don't monitor more than half a dozen of them. So we have no idea what difference they are making to sea temperature, particularly in places like the Arctic and Antarctic, where otherwise there'll be more ice than when the volcanoes are going off. We do know that the most active volcano in Antarctica, Mount Erebus, makes an enormous difference when it blows off, which it does quite often. So I suspect that the Antarctic loss of sea ice recently is a temporary phenomenon caused by some local event like that. But the growth in sea ice over the last 35 years is the most notable feature in Antarctica. And of course, the BBC was very careful in its report this morning not to mention any of what I've just mentioned to you, because it doesn't fit the Communist Party line on the climate. So now we come to the models. Now, the models originally predicted, and this goes back to Jules Charney, who did a report for the National Academy of Sciences in the United States in 1979. At that time, he said that there would be somewhere between 1.5 and 4.5 Celsius of global warming per doubling of CO2, with a best estimate of 2.5, which he however bumped up to 3 because he thought it seemed simpler to simply take the middle position between 1.5 and 4.5. Now, the nature of the feedback response curve is such that 2.5 would have been the correct estimate given the way that he was doing it, but he didn't understand the feedback response curve, so he didn't know that. So already we went up from, actually it was 2.4, he stated, as being the mid position. He pushed that up to 3. That was the value that was then used in the original IPCC report. And the interval of 1.5 to 4.5 Kelvin, because they don't really know how much global warming CO2 is going to cause, has remained even in the fifth assessment report of the IPCC. So trillions spent and no real adjustment to the amount of warming we might expect. Now then came along the climate models of the coupled model intercomparison project. And what they said in their fifth generation models, they produce new ones almost every year. This was about 5 years ago. They said there would be 3.35 Celsius of global warming per doubling of CO2, which is the standard metric, and that's what they call the equilibrium warming after everything has settled down and the feedbacks have acted. And the sixth generation models of the IPCC, not the IPCC, the coupled model intercomparison project, are now saying that the minimum global warming we'll get per doubling of CO2 is 3 Celsius, which is the original mid-range estimate. They're now saying that's the bottom end, and that it might be their central estimate is now coming up to 4.1 Celsius per doubling of CO2, and the top end is 5.2. And in the Cilia papers, they even talk of up to 10 or 11 Celsius per CO2 doubling. And here in the UK, the Stern report of 2006 for the then socialist government, trying to justify spending money on making barely existent global warming go away, was predicated on the assumption that at the high end there might indeed be 11 Celsius of warming by the end of this century, which is equivalent, roughly speaking, to 10 or 11 Celsius of warming per doubling of CO2, and that therefore that would mean there was a 1 in 10 chance that global warming caused by us would bring the world to an end. After 4.5 billion years, we tweak the atmosphere by 1 part in 10,000 and the world suddenly comes to an end. That was the ludicrous assumption on the basis of which the Stern report decided we had to spend money on climate change. And everybody else, including, say, Garnaut in Australia and all the other governments, they no longer use the commercial intertemporal discount rate of 7 or 8% per annum compound to decide whether it's worth money, whether it's worth our while to spend money now on making global warming go away. Because if you used any discount rate like that, then clearly after 20 or 30 years, there's no point in spending any money at all on it. So it's clear they can't do that. So they have adopted this bogus notion that if we don't do something, there's a 1 in 10 chance the world will come to an end by 2100. So we now get back to the projections of the models, which, as I say, are now just over 4 Kelvin, 4.06 to be exact, if you take the average of the 21 models of the CMIP 6th generation, which reported their results in September, and I was sent them by my good friend and academic colleague, Dr. Willie Soon. And so what I did was to do a few sums, and it turns out that there are some staggering mistakes that climatologists have made, really elementary mistakes, so elementary that you can show by simple arithmetic that anything like the predicted warming that they are suggesting is plumb wrong. And we start by making a rather important and elementary scientific observation, which is that real world data trumps modeling every time.
Yeah.
What we want to do is to see what has actually happened. Now, back in 1990, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in its first assessment report, said that there would be the equivalent of 3.1 Celsius of global warming per doubling of CO2 in the medium term. In other words, up until about now. 3.1 Celsius is what they said. The actual amount of warming we've had is not 3.1 Celsius per century, therefore sort of 0.31.
Per doubling. Sorry, did you mean per doubling?
Per century. Century. Because per doubling, it's also, they're now saying it's 4, you see, but they're saying that per century,
okay,
they said it would be, even in the short term, it would be 0.31 per decade, so the equivalent is 3.1 per century, and that's about the equivalent of 3.1 Celsius per doubling of CO2. And indeed, 3 Celsius was their best estimate at that time. Now, because roughly speaking, the amount of various greenhouse gases we emit is in a century the same as if we'd emitted just enough to double CO2 over that century. That's why the numbers are the same.
Right.
But the actual amount of warming per decade that we've had in the 30 years since they made that first prediction is only 0.13. It's about just over a third of what they had originally predicted. Now, this is a very serious discrepancy that you will not find mentioned anywhere in the reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They've gone completely quiet about it, and instead they're ever increasing their predictions, even as the warming that they predict is simply not even, not much more than 1/3 of it is actually happening.
Okay,
course,
so just to be sure, just to be clear there, the actual empirical evidence is that a third of as much warming as they predicted is occurring, but the models are not being adjusted appropriately You're hinting that they're being exaggerated in the other way, and then of course models are used as evidence, aren't they? They're used as data, which you just said that they're not. Models are not data.
You've summed that up very well. And what they did in the fifth assessment report, they did actually finally mention that it looked as though there wasn't quite as much warming as they predicted. In fact, at that time, there hadn't been any warming for about 18 years. So they were beginning to become rather worried that something fundamental was wrong, which, as I shall reveal in a moment, it certainly is. They don't know it yet, but they soon will. And so they adjusted their medium-term projection to 1.4 Celsius per century equivalent, or 0.14, about a seventh of a Celsius per decade. And that's, of course, pretty much in line with the 0.13 Celsius per decade, which has actually happened. They made that adjustment but at my insistence, because I was an expert reviewer for that report, and I said, you can't go on pretending to predict that in the medium term there's going to be getting on for 3 times the warming that we've actually seen over the past 30 years since you first made that prediction. You're losing credibility. Yep. So what they did was they adjusted the medium-term warming, and they said, okay, well, yes, we agree that's got to be adjusted in line with what's been observed, but we're not going to reduce the long-term warming, which should, of course, be reduced pari passu with that warming. And how do I know that it should be? Because there's another way of using direct evidence in order to calculate what the so-called Charney sensitivity is. Charney sensitivity is the amount of warming you get after it's all settled down again and all the feedbacks have acted in response to a doubling of CO2 concentration. So that's the sort of standard metric that they use. And if you look at that metric, as I say, they now predict 4.06 Celsius per doubling of CO2 as Charney sensitivity. Mm-hmm. But there's a way of working out what it is from the warming we've had so far, from the radiative forcings, the change in the amount of radiation knocking around in the atmosphere that our greenhouse gas emissions have caused. And they think they're reasonably sure about those numbers. And then there's also that fraction of the forcing that we've caused that hasn't yet led to warming, because the oceans have a huge heat capacity and they delay things. And so all you have to do is to take the 0.75 Celsius observed warming from 1850 until 2011, which is the year to which they cast up all the numbers for their most recent report. And then what you do is you divide that by the difference between the 2.5 watts per square meter total anthropogenic forcing over the same period, subtracting from that forcing, before you do the division, the 0.6 watts per square meter that hasn't yet led to the warming they would expect it to lead to. And when you do that and multiply by the 1 Kelvin of directly forced warming that you get per doubling of CO2, and all of this may sound like gobbledygook, but it's very simple arithmetic, and you can at least see that much, you get an answer of 1.3 Celsius of warming per doubling of CO2, or per century, which is exactly what we're seeing in the observed record. So now we've got the observed record saying it's going to be 1.3. We've got that calculation based on their estimates of how much radiative forcing, as it's called, we have caused by adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. That gives you 1.3. Mm-hmm. And yet they're saying it's going to be 4.1. So clearly they're doing something very, very wrong. They are misunderstanding something very fundamental. And it turns out, and my team has been investigating this for 3 years, and we now reckon we've got the answer. And they're doing 2 things wrong. They've made 2 truly enormous errors of physics, in addition to the errors of physics I've just explained, in that they've ignored the actual temperature change, and they've ignored their own estimates of how much warming we ought to be expecting, given the amount of greenhouse gases they think we're putting into the atmosphere. So they made those 2 mistakes, but they've made 2 more, and these are real Lulus. Because the first one, which I'll talk about first, is that they have forgotten at a vital point in their calculations that the sun is shining. Now, okay, if they're all Scots, they won't see the sun very much, as they might forget that it's shining. But everywhere else in the world, we do see the sunshine all the time. And so what they did was they forgot the sun was shining. And so when they were trying to work out, you get a certain amount of direct warming if you put greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And per doubling of CO2, the direct warming you'll get is only 1 Celsius per doubling of CO2. That's their figure from the 5th generation of the CMIP models. Mm-hmm. So one Celsius only of warming per doubling of CO2. That's the direct warming. But then there's a knock-on extra warming caused by the fact that the atmosphere has warmed up. And it can therefore hold more water vapor if it's warmer.
Yeah.
And this is a well-established result in climatology. It is true it can hold more water vapor, and it can hold approximately 7% more water vapor for every Celsius of warming that you heat the atmosphere with. But this warming is not observed in the tropical mid-troposphere, the one place where it would have to be observed at the rate they predict. And they predict that it should be happening there at 3 times the tropical surface rate. This is known as the tropical mid-troposphere hotspot. I had the honor to name it, but it doesn't exist in reality. We have 20 million radiosonde profiles taken by balloons taking electronic gadgetry up through the atmosphere all the way to the mid-stratosphere. And they do not show the tropical mid-troposphere hotspot. It is not there. It is absent. And therefore we wouldn't expect to get a large water vapor feedback. And yet they're still trying to pretend that that water vapor feedback is going to multiply by 4 the 1 Celsius direct warming from doubling CO2. So what they did wrong was they misdefined feedback. This process by which the water vapor increases in the atmosphere, they misdefined feedback itself. Now, the concept of feedback comes from what's called control theory. It's a branch of engineering physics, which was first developed in the 1920s at Bell Labs in New York by Harold S. Black, who invented negative feedback, for instance, when he was traveling one day on the Lackawanna ferry to get to work. And they've still got his copy of the New York Times in which he scribbled down hastily the equations before he forgot them. And that's how negative feedback, which then came very useful for stabilizing telephone circuits, came into existence. So the climatologist came along in the 1980s, Hansen in particular in 1984 at NASA, and they borrowed this mathematics of feedback. But from Hansen onwards, they screwed up. Right. And they realize that feedback processes such as the water vapor feedback do not only respond to changes in temperature, such as that which we cause if we add CO2 to the atmosphere. They also respond to the temperature that would have been there already, even if there were no greenhouse gases. Now, that temperature that would have been there, even if there were no greenhouse gases at all, is called the emission temperature. It's the temperature that is simply caused by the fact that the sun is shining. And this is where it leads on to their next mistake. That emission temperature, they think, is about 255 Kelvin, or minus 18 Celsius. Now, they get to that by making the assumption that the sunshine, the amount of radiation from the sun, will be the same as it is today, but that there will also be clouds in the air, just as there are today, reflecting a lot of the sunlight, about 29% of it, harmlessly back into space, so it doesn't cause any warming down here, because clouds have a net cooling effect, though they try to pretend they have a net warming effect, but they don't. So they imagine that when they calculate emission temperature, they're calculating it on the basis that there are clouds there. And what are clouds made of, Nigel? You tell me.
Water vapor on condensation nuclei.
They are made of water vapor on condensation nuclei. You are very well informed. Particles of dust and grit and so forth, and cosmic ray particles. That's how the clouds form. So they're basically made of water vapor. Now, what kind of a gas is water vapor? It's a greenhouse gas.
A greenhouse gas, yeah.
So here they are. They define emission temperature as the temperature without greenhouse gases, but they calculate it by assuming that the most important of all the greenhouse gases, because of its quantity in the atmosphere, water vapor, is actually present to the same degree as it is today. So this huge contradiction, they have misdefined and therefore miscalculated temperature feedback. And this was first pointed out by the world's most eminent, distinguished and experienced atmospheric physicist, Professor Richard Lindzen at MIT, in a peer-reviewed published paper all the way back in 1994. And recently my colleague Willie Soon discovered this paper and sent it to me. We're very excited because I had actually discovered this myself. I'd done some calculations and I told my co-authors, I think the emission temperature is more like 274 Kelvin than 255. And they all said, oh, no, this calculation you've done, it's terribly complicated. You've used 1 billion different spherical thruster, and you've calculated the different temperatures for each, and you've done an integration, and we think you've probably got it wrong somewhere. Anyway, I got the same answer as Professor Lindzen without even knowing his result. So then I calibrated that answer against the lunar diviner experiments, because you can do a similar calculation for the moon once you know the reflectance of the moon. And I was able to reproduce the curve that they had sent up a satellite costing many billions to determine, and I could have done it on the back of an envelope down here for them. They need to spend the money. And this is because they so often forget that you can do science by using these wonderful elementary physical formulae that worked out in the previous centuries by people like Isaac Newton and Ludwig Boltzmann and his colleague Stefan. And you can use these fundamental equations, and they're not at all difficult equations to use, and you can get the answers that they use, these very expensive machines, and then they go and get it wrong. But the point is that the emission temperature should indeed be 274 Kelvin. Why does this matter? Well, it matters because if we forget for the moment any anthropogenic contribution, because there wasn't any up until about 1850, we can look at what was the situation in 1850 before we kind of messed up with it very much. And at that time, in 1850, the temperature of the Earth, expressed in Kelvin, which is how we climate buffs do everything, and that's, you have to sort of deduct 273 from the Kelvin to get Celsius. But anyway, it's 287.5 Kelvin, 287, call it in round numbers, so about 14 Celsius. That was the average temperature on the world then. But you see, if the emission temperature was 255 Kelvin, then you've got 32 Kelvin of what they call the natural greenhouse effect, of which they say, you can read Dr. Lacey's paper of 2010 on this, they say 8 Kelvin of that is directly forced warming from all the greenhouse gases that were there before we came along in 1850. And the other 24 Kelvin is this knock-on warming, the feedback response, all of which they say comes from that 8 Kelvin. So you can see if you take 8 Kelvin and multiply it by 4, you get the 32 Kelvin natural greenhouse effect. So now, when they're looking at how much warming are we going to get per doubling of CO2, they start with the 1 Kelvin warming that you get straight away, the direct warming from doubling CO2, and they multiply it by the same factor, 4. Right. Because they get that from what they imagine is this huge natural greenhouse effect of 32 Kelvin, of which only a quarter is from the direct forcing and the rest is the feedbacks. So that's why they think feedbacks are so huge, and that's why they think global warming is so huge. Now, if we now do 274 Kelvin to 287 Kelvin, that's only a 13 Kelvin so-called natural greenhouse effect, of which 8 Kelvin is still the directly forced warming from the greenhouse gases. Only 5 Kelvin is now feedback response. And remember that probably 4 of that 5 Kelvin is going to be feedback response to the 255 to 274 Kelvin emission temperature. Only about 1 Kelvin, maybe 2 if you really push it, perhaps 3 if you try it really hard, could possibly be coming in addition to the 8 Kelvin from the greenhouse gases. And what does that mean? It means, best estimate, you're going to get about 1.3 to 1.4 Kelvin per doubling of CO2 concentration. And where have we heard that figure before? We see it in the temperature record. We see it if you calculate from their estimates of both the temperature record and the various greenhouse gas forcings that we're guilty of and the radiative imbalance. And we get the same value once we've corrected for these 2 further monstrous errors in the way they do the sums. Hmm. So the answer is that we're only going to see 2 further monstrous errors in the way they do the sums. So the answer is that we're only going to see 2 further monstrous errors in the way they do the sums. So the answer is that we're only going to see 2 further monstrous errors in the way they do the sums. So the answer is that we're only going to see 2 further monstrous errors in the way they do the sums. So the answer is that we're only going to see 2 further monstrous errors in the way they do the sums. So the answer is that we're only going to see 2 further monstrous errors in the way they do the sums. So the answer is that we're only going to see 2 further monstrous errors in the way they do the sums. So the answer is that we're only going to see 2 further monstrous errors in the way they do the sums. So the answer is that we're only going to see 2 further monstrous errors in the way they do the sums. So the answer is that we're only going to see 2 further monstrous errors in the way they do the sums. So the answer is that we're only going to see 2 further monstrous errors in the 1.3, 1.4, absolute tops, I would think, 1.5 Kelvin or Celsius, because they're the same difference between each other, of global warming per doubling of CO2 concentration. And what that means is end of climate scare. There is no longer a climate crisis, a climate emergency. The planet is not going to fry. It's not going to come to an end by 2100 because of global warming. We might blow it up with cobalt bombs, but we're certainly not going to destroy it by 1.3 Celsius of, or if compared with now, about 1.1 Celsius of further warming over the rest of the 21st century. It's going to be slow, small, steady, harmless, and what's more, net beneficial to the planet. Because if you put more CO2 in the atmosphere, you get more plant growth, you get more plant biomass. The plant biomass on Earth has gone up by between 15 and 30% over the last 15 or 30 years. Depends on whose figures you believe, but it's certainly an enormous increase, which is so large you can see it from satellites in space. So this enormous extra amount of CO2 is terrifically beneficial to rather plant growth. Is beneficial because you then get more oxygen coming out of the plants, and of course the plants then provide all the habitats for creatures. So the idea that this is somehow a bad thing is a monstrous nonsense, even if we were going to see the sort of warming that they predicted. Because if, for instance, the high-end warming they've been predicting for this century, of course, is 5.4 Kelvin, very close to the 5.2 Kelvin high-end CO2 doubling warming that they're predicting. Yep. And the European commissars, desperate to please their Russian paymasters by who are selling natural gas from their fields in Siberia into Europe at anything up to 4 times the world price, because the commissars let them get away with it because they're under the thumb of Putin. They had some research done which they hoped they would please Putin just a couple of years ago, and they said how many fewer people would be alive in Europe if, instead of having the warmth that we have today, we had the extra 5.4 Celsius of warming that is the top end prediction of the models. So the researchers went away and came back looking rather crestfallen, and they said, well, there wouldn't be fewer people alive, there'd be 94,000 more people alive if we got that amount of extra warming. And the reason is, of course, that it's cold that's the big killer. And that's why every previous climate optimum, warm period, called a climate optimum. Yeah. Because optimum is the Latin for best. Yeah. Warmer is better. And every meteorologist, until the global warming scam came along, realized that warmer weather was better for the world. It's even better for the tropics, because the atmosphere is an engine which transmits any extra warming, because most of the warming comes in the tropics. It transmits it to the rest of the world, warming us up, and by golly, we could do with it here down in Gloucester, I tell you. And so the tropics tend to keep more or less the same temperature. All that happens if you heat up the tropics, or try to, is that you get earlier tropical afternoon convection. That's the thunderstorms that normally start about 2 in the afternoon. You warm it up a bit, they'll start at 12 in the morning. And thunderstorms lift the heat away from the tropics and cool everything down by rainfall that comes back in turn. So the idea that somehow the tropics are going to burn up and the poor people in the tropics are going to suffer because of global warming isn't the case. We are suffering because there isn't enough global warming. We could do more of the tropics. Well, far from suffering, they'll get more rainfall, because, of course, what happens if you do have more water vapor in the atmosphere, you get a bit more rainfall. That's why the area of the Earth under drought has been declining throughout the last 35 years, a point you never see the BBC mentioning, for instance.
Lord Monckton, one of the things that thank you for all that to do with these climate models. It's fascinating how over-exaggerated they are, and indeed the fact that it wouldn't even be a problem anyway if we were to get experience average global temperatures going up slightly.
The important thing about what I've said is that everything I've done is by simple arithmetic, none of which you can refute. I mean, these are the numbers they use. I just say, okay, we use their numbers, we correct the ones that are wrong by using evidence from the peer-reviewed journals, and by understanding why the peer-reviewed journals say they're wrong. And that's Lindson's paper saying, they've used clouds in calculating the emission temperature, when by definition there wouldn't be any. That kind of elementary mistake is what they've done. And then misdefining feedback. You can go to page 1450 of the IPCC's fifth assessment report, and you'll see the misdefinition of feedback is explicit there. They say that feedback is a response only to a change, and not the pre-existing temperature.
No.
That's a huge mistake of definition, and it leads to this huge mistake of not realizing that most of the feedback response that is in the climate doesn't, which is a lot smaller than they think it is anyway because of the emission temperature problem, is going to come from the sunshine temperature. It's not going to come from us. And that's why you get this very much smaller. And because all of this is elementary, I actually did an experiment on Monday. A group of people in a pub in Ely gathered, there were 50 of them. And I said, I'm going to explain this to you. And all you need is a piece of paper and a pencil, and I'll give you the numbers. They were able to work out how much global warming we're going to get just from using these elementary numbers. It is as simple as that. And so we're now busy trying to get our paper on this published by a learned journal. We've been rejected a few times on the stupidest grounds. So now we've gone to another journal where we hope we'll get a fairer hearing. And if we do, and we get published kind of around the turn of the year, then that will mark, scientifically speaking, the end of the global warming scare. Because if you divide all their numbers by 3, then suddenly we do not have a climate crisis. We have slightly warmer weather worldwide, which is a very good thing. We have sea level growing at a rate of between 2 and 8 inches over the next century. It grew by about 7 inches over the last one. Entirely harmless. And all the various imagined problems that flow from very rapid and very large global warming will be imaginary, because the very rapid and very large global warming they've imagined is itself imaginary, and therefore cannot cause the phenomena they say it can cause. It's really very, very simple, all this. And this, I think, is what's going to prove to be completely deadly to the cause of climate communism. Until now, they've said the climate is such a complicated place, only the experts, only the huge models which replicate faithfully all the physical processes going on in the climate can possibly give us an answer. But Professor Frank, a good friend of mine, Pat Frank, from the Stanford Linear Accelerator, just last month published a devastating paper showing that uncertainty as to how much forcing you'll get from clouds from year to year, which is 4 watts per square meter per year uncertain. If you propagate that uncertainty using the standard root mean squared error propagation formula, which is well understood in statistics and well established, and it worked just fine, then you find that the envelope of uncertainty within which, if the models make a prediction, they are simply guessing, is plus or minus 15 Celsius. Now that's simply a statistical yardstick. And that if it isn't a real uncertainty, that's the yardstick of uncertainty that's caused by this error propagation. And therefore, if they make predictions which are less than plus or minus 15 Celsius of global warming per number of CO2, and of course obviously they're a lot less than that, then those predictions in the models are nothing better than guesswork, and that therefore he has formally demonstrated and published after 13 journals rejected him on the most ludicrous of grounds. He's demonstrated formally, and eventually 2 of the most eminent climate scientists on the other side reviewed his paper, and they said, we don't like this result, but we cannot find a hole in it, and we think therefore that for purposes of discussion it should be published. And it has been published in a peer-reviewed journal. And of course, the climate communist scientists are furious at this. They're trying to find holes in it. But all that they do every time they attack it is show their staggering ignorance just as much of elementary statistics as of elementary control theory. In all areas of science outside their area of expertise, they simply get it wrong and don't bother to check. They just rush in and say, well, we'll adopt whatever position fits the Climate Communist Party line. We won't go and check. And so his paper is being trashed on all the websites that the left-wing so-called scientists use. But he is very easily able to answer them and knock them down flat because they just don't know what they're talking about.
Brilliant.
So that's also absolutely fascinating. It's very, very clear that the models that they rely upon as their major so-called evidence for the so-called large global warming are incapable of telling us anything about global warming at all. They may have many other uses, but as far as telling us about how much global warming they're going to get, in Pat Frank's blunt phrase, they are useless. They are without value. They have nothing to contribute whatsoever.
No. One of the other things you mentioned, the temperature record a while ago, and to me, I'm gobsmacked. I've seen several graphs. We've probably all seen them. The ice core samples and going back, I think sort of 600 million years or so, and we can see the trace of atmospheric carbon dioxide, historically much higher than today, and we can see temperature, and over that time span there seems to be zero correlation whatsoever. I mean,
well, it's very interesting. Let's just do that. We first of all go back just 800,000 years, because our ice core records only go back that far.
Yeah.
And really only the first 10,000 years of that can you get annually resolved concentrations of CO2, and you can also get the temperature from the air trapped in those layers of ice, because it turns out, this is a wonderful piece of scientific detective work, but if you have oxygen, which comes in two different isotopes in air, the ratio of those two isotopes in air tells you what the temperature of that air was at the time when it got trapped. How it does this, I cannot tell you, but that's how they reconstruct past temperatures.
And is that data undisputed? I mean,
it's pretty. I mean, it's certainly above my pay grade to dispute it. But I'll tell you what it shows. What it shows is that over the last 800,000 years, global mean surface temperature has varied only by about 3 Celsius up or down from the 800,000 year average. It hardly changes, even with asteroids hitting and ice sheets coming and going. These tiny changes up or down in temperature. And what this means is that the system is essentially thermostatic. It doesn't change very much. And so my good friends Michael and Ronan Connolly in Ireland, who are formidable physicists, both have got dozens of doctorates between them, and they each have in their house their own laboratory. They've been working away at finding out why the atmosphere is thermostatic, given that with all these greenhouse gases coming in and then being taken out again, the huge variations, why do we not get correspondingly huge variations in temperature?
Yeah.
Why hasn't it been happening for 800,000 years? So what they discovered was they examined these radio sound records, where you put an electronics package on the bottom of a balloon and let it up into the sky. And it takes measurements at certain preset pressure altitudes. When it knows the barometric pressure is, say, 300 millibars, then it's in the mid-troposphere. It'll take a measurement there of what the temperature is and which way the wind's blowing and how strong it is, and the water vapor content is. And then it reports all that by radio back down to the ground. The clue is in the name, radio sound. So they've got 20 million of these measurements going back 80 years, which have been compiled by various people all over the world. And also some of the air forces drop sondes from above, so they fall downwards through the atmosphere. They can do it in reverse. So they've got this wonderful record, which gives you a much more detailed and much more finely resolved atmospheric profile than anything you can do by trying to observe the atmosphere from the ground, or for that matter from satellites. So these radio sound records hold the key to this, and they couldn't understand why the plot of temperature with atmospheric pressure and therefore with altitude was a rather squiggly line as you go through the troposphere. Of course, at the tropopause, it all settles down, and then you're up into the stratosphere, and it's more sensible thereafter. But in the troposphere, it's a hell of a mess. And they couldn't think why they were getting this squiggly line in all the data sets. This is a well-known phenomenon, the squiggly line, given by the radio sound data sets. So what they did was to rearrange the terms in the ideal gas equation, which is a conflation of Boyle's law, Maxwell's law, and a couple of other fundamental gas laws. And they put molar density on the left-hand side of the equation and everything else on the right-hand side. Suddenly, they then replotted what was going on in the atmosphere, plotting molar density against pressure altitude. Bingo. Straight line, all the way through the troposphere, straight line. Little bit of variation in the Arctic, down only in the lower troposphere, but a straight line all the way up to where the stratosphere begins, all the way up to the tropopause. Now, what that means is, and this is absolutely fascinating, that although it was previously thought that no gas can be a real ideal gas, turns out that the atmosphere taken as a whole is behaving near perfectly as an ideal gas. Now, I, being a simple-minded classicist, will assume that because the outer boundary of the atmosphere is outer space. So any extra heat you generate here will tend just to get radiated out to outer space eventually, or taken up into the oceans, which are another formidably large heat sink. Yes. So you kind of expect it to be behaving like an ideal gas because of what are called its boundary conditions. But it turns out that it does behave as an ideal gas, and these straight lines are so straight that you can calculate what's called the R squared, or the coefficient of determination, which tells you how much uncertainty there is as to whether this really is a straight line.
But how does that relate? How does the atmosphere as a whole behaving like an ideal gas?
Come to that.
Yeah,
I just want to say that it is one first, and to show you just how much of one it is.
Okay.
Because the R squared coefficient, this is absolutely fact, is 0.99997 to 0.99998. It's about the highest correlation you'll ever hope to see. So it's very, very high. So that means it really is an ideal gas. And I keep telling them, for goodness sake, write this up and put it in a proper peer-reviewed journal, because on its own, this is even if it had nothing to do with global warming, it's a fascinating aperçu. When Michael Connolly discovered this, he went into Ronan's room. He said, "Look what I've found." And Ronan said, "Oh, you must have made a mistake. It's too good to be true. It can't be a straight line." So they then spent the whole night, they stayed up all night, taking random records from these 20 million all down the years, and every single one of them showed exactly the same result. So what does it mean?
What does it tell us about how the atmosphere remains stable? Yeah.
Exactly. This was what they then turned their minds to. And they did a lot of reading, a lot of thinking. And eventually, a couple of years ago, they discovered a paper by Albert Einstein, published in 2017, on quantum radiation. This is how radiation works right down at the tiny level of individual molecules and setting up a quantum resonance, which is by definition heat. That's how we know that CO2, if it interacts with a photon, can emit heat. But now we know what happens to the heat doesn't hang around in the atmosphere, because the atmosphere is an ideal gas, because, says Einstein, or at least they infer this from Einstein's paper.
Yeah. And
how they infer it is at the moment above my pay grade. I'm about to go and spend a couple of days with them so they can teach me how to understand this. But at present, as best I understand it, what they say he is saying is that in an ideal gas, a phenomenon such as the greenhouse effect, even though that effect is real and measurable, cannot cause any net global warming of that gas at all.
Right.
And that means that the effect of greenhouse gases on the atmosphere is zero. It's not causing any warming, whatever. We can change them all we like, take them in, put them out, and that's it. So that means the emission temperature we were talking about before, which they thought was 255 Kelvin, and I calculated at 274, it's actually probably 288, which is today's temperature. And therefore, temperature will vary with fluctuations in the amount of sunlight reaching us, which can happen both because the sun itself waxes and wanes, and also because you can pass through spiral arms of the galaxy with a lot of dust and filth that filter out a lot of the sunshine. That will obviously change things because you're changing the amount of heat coming in. Get temporary changes down here because of changes in the ocean circulation, throwing heat up through the El Nino Southern Oscillation and that kind of thing. And there are no doubt longer term secular changes that also happen that we don't yet really know much about. But what you can't get, if they are right, and as I say, it's above my pay grade to say whether they are right in interpreting Einstein this way, but if they are right, then this is the most beautiful result that has ever been attained in climatology. I mean, let's be really clear. This is very, very clever stuff if it's right. It's well worthy of a Nobel Prize in physics.
Yep.
I think it's outstanding. So I have begged them, and my good colleague Willie Soon, who's also a co-author of theirs as he is with me in our efforts, to make them get on with it and be disciplined and really nail it down and get it beautifully written and published, because there's no way out. If he's right, if the Connollys are right, then that is the end of the global warming scare. I had dinner with them. It was a 6-hour scientific dinner in Dublin just a few weeks ago, which is where I picked all this up. And Professor Ray Bates of University College Dublin came along as well. And he was as fascinated as I was. He, like me, is not yet sure that they're right, because he, like me, I suspect, finds all this rocket science that's slightly out of our comfort zone. And we're going to have to do a lot of learning before we understand it. But if they are right, it's a very, very beautiful result. And it means that there's simply no basis for imagining there's going to be any global warming caused by us at all. It's just not going to happen.
Well, that's very reassuring to hear. But I mean, one of the things that's always struck me as odd and leads me to jump to the same conclusion you've just arrived at, only without half as much intelligent calculations and so forth, is looking at the temperature record and learning that both CO2 concentrations and temperature have been historically much higher. So for me, that it seems like it should be the same for anybody. Any rational thinking mind should think, well, if we've already been much warmer, what's the concern about getting warmer? I mean, that's just a fundamental, does not compute in my head.
Quite right. Let's now go back beyond 800,000 years. I had to stop there and just do that bit because it led into the Connellys and what they've discovered. Let's now go back 750 million years. No, going back not thousands of years, but millions of years now, to the Neo-Proterozoic in the Precambrian. We go back that far. At that time, there wasn't the 400 parts per million or 0.04% CO2 in the atmosphere that there is today. And I often put this to people who don't know how much CO2 there is in the atmosphere, to the nearest 10%. No, sorry, the nearest tenth of 1%. There is no CO2 in the atmosphere at all. That's a useful figure to throw at people. But there was 7,000 parts per million, 750 million years ago. And they can reconstruct that in various clever ways that don't involve ice cores. Obviously, there isn't any ice around that's as old as that. But they've worked that out. And yet, the temperature was, of course, it was warmer than it is today by, they think, maybe as much as 10 or 12 Celsius. But then it would be if you had that amount of extra CO2 in the air. But there's, as you say, the correlation between the reconstructions of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere over the last 750 million years and the temperature over the same long period is such a poor match that you really can't infer that CO2 is the main driver of all this at all. No. So you're right about that. But underlying that, there's an even simpler question, which I have now started asking because you watch them gasping as they try to answer it. You simply say to the other side, could you please refer me to any peer-reviewed paper which tells us what is the ideal global mean surface temperature for life on Earth today? And they're rather quiet.
Resounding silence.
Reader, I want a paper which produces scientific evidence that says, it's X, it's 290 Kelvin, 204. What is the ideal global mean surface temperature? Now, the fact that, as far as I can discover, there is no peer-reviewed paper in which that question has ever been asked, that tells you that we're dealing with politics and not science. And the fact that it hasn't been answered means there is absolutely no basis for saying that even 5.4 Celsius of warming per doubling of CO2 or per century is going to be damaging. Because if you don't know what the ideal surface temperature is, how can you tell that it isn't that temperature or a temperature even higher than that? You have no rational scientific basis for saying that that amount of warming will be dangerous.
No. And also, of course, the use of...
They cannot answer this.
No.
They say, oh, but it's the rate... They often get forced back. Oh, it's the rate of warming that's unprecedented. So then I say, well, we actually have one temperature record. It's a regional one and not a global one. But it goes back to 1759. And that is what's called the Central England temperature record. And it covers the whole of England, down from Gloucestershire all the way up to practically Yorkshire. So it's most of England, and they used to keep very good temperature measurements. And they weren't very highly resolved in the early period. But what we do know is that from 1694 until 1733, a period of 40 years, Central England, and inferentially the world, because we're kind of the right latitude for this to be quite a good proxy for global temperature change, Central England warmed at a rate equivalent to 4 1/3 Celsius degrees per century, even higher than what they are now predicting for CO2. And it couldn't have been anything to do with CO2 because we weren't emitting enough. There just weren't enough of us to emit and make that difference.
Was that as we were coming out of the mini ice age?
We were coming out of a thing called the Maunder minimum, when for 70 years there was no sunspots on the sun. And this was only rediscovered in the 19th century by Maunder, who was an astronomical bureaucrat at the Greenwich Observatory, where they'd kept all these records and faithfully recorded no sunspots on the sun for 70 years. And nobody had thought, does this mean anything? Because they didn't have enough measurement capacity at that time to work out this meant the sun was 0.2% cooler over that period. And that 0.2% doesn't amount to much if it only happens for a year or two, but if it happens for 70 or 80 years, because the change in temperature on Earth appears to go as what's called the 60-year time integral of the sunshine. You take a sort of a moving average of 60 years total solar irradiance. That does make a difference to temperature down here. And in fact, even over a shorter term, it makes a difference, because Herschel, back in, I think, 1802, noticed there was a strange correlation between the coming and going of sunspots on the sun and the price of corn on the London market. And he realized that the sunspots, when they were there, were giving us a warmer climate, and therefore you were getting a greater crop, and therefore the price on the corn exchanges would fall. And you could even see this from year to year, and over the 11-year cycle. So the sun has much more influence on global climate than the climatologists are willing to admit. And we have these wonderful historical records that show us this. And they try to ignore all this. And talking of historical records, one of the things you can do is to check whether the hockey stick graph produced by Michael Mann, and if you remember, he sued somebody for saying that he shouldn't be at Penn State, he should be in the state pen, because of the way this graph had been cobbled together. Now, I am merely repeating what was said in open court, so I can't be sued for saying that. And the case, incidentally, has just been thrown out by...
Yeah. It was Professor Tim Ball, wasn't it?
That's right, and the case is thrown out, and a man at first huffed and puffed and said he had the right to appeal, but the 30-day appeal period expired, he hadn't lodged one, so I think he knew that that was it. It's all over now, he's lost that case. So now we can say, perfectly freely, quoting the court papers, that he is said to be better off in the state pen than the Penn State. Well, this hockey stick graph, which was used by the IPCC for a time as its symbol, because they were so pleased with this apparent catastrophic increase in the CO2 concentration and the temperature as well, and there was no way of arguing anymore. This was mankind causing a terrible, irreversible change in the climate, a climate emergency. Well, of course, along came Michaels and McKittrick with their paper knocking it flat, followed by an even more devastating report by the Congressional Committee on Climate Change in the House of Representatives, which the Wegman report, both of which tore it to shreds. But still, the IPCC and a lot of the climate communists in the system are trying to say that that's right, and they produce all sorts of bogus replications of it. What I did was a really simple experiment. They say that if the Earth's atmosphere warms up, then the ocean warms up, and therefore you get a bit of ice melt, and you get a lot of expansion, thermostatic expansion of the seawater, so that it occupies more space, or the top layer of it does, because the bottom end colder layers don't change very much. And therefore you get sea level rise. So I thought to myself, I wonder if, in addition to the reconstructions of temperature going back 1,000 years, there is a reconstruction of sea level rise going back that far. Because you see, there are two competing curves for the 1,000-year evolution of global temperature. In the medieval warm period, Hubert Lamb's graph, and he was one of the most formidable atmospheric physicists we've ever had, he was at East Anglia. You had the medieval warm period, up came the temperature, and then down it came again into the Little Ice Age, and then up again, and somewhere in between the two is where it now is. So you get this kind of sinusoidal curve like that. Now, that was his curve, but then the Michael Mann curve said there was no medieval warm period. It just started off down here, and it actually went down from the Middle Ages into the Little Ice Age, and then it came up really sharply, like a hockey stick or a Nazi salute. And so this was the hockey stick curve. But I thought, well, if there is a sea level graph showing sea level change reconstructed, then that will fit one or other or neither of those graphs. Maybe they're both wrong. So I did that exercise, and it's absolutely fascinating because the sea level change does not fit the hockey stick graph at all. It's completely different. It does fit the Lamb graph, medieval warm period, little ice age, and then today, like a glove. You can actually overlay the two, and they hardly diverge at any point over 1,000 years. Okay. So what that means is, by this very simple method, I have established that the hockey stick graph cannot be correct. And I suppose I ought to write a paper on it, because they're still peddling this nonsense in IPCC reports. So, one of my future papers is going to be on this very question, just looking at the correlation between these two graphs, because although you cannot say that correlation necessarily entails causation, you can say, and this is logically correct, that absence of correlation necessarily entails absence of causation. Indeed. And therefore we know from that the hockey stick graph is wrong. And so when I was giving a talk on this to the intelligence school of the Army of Colombia, they said, would I go and teach to the James Bonds a bit about how to evaluate intelligence in a field in which you don't know anything? And like me, I'm a classicist. What do I know about climate change? And so when I first began to get into it, I had to produce an evaluation for the hedge fund that had asked me to look at it, which was correct, even though I was not a climatologist. And they'd come to me precisely because I wasn't a scientist, but that I was a logician, and I could therefore analyze evidence in a way in which many scientists have lost the art of doing because they no longer study logic. So I did this, and I found these two curves, and the fact that the Lamb curve is correct and the hockey stick graph is wrong, because the sea level curve tells you which is right. And so I explained all this. I said, if you're a James Bond, you don't need to know about climate change, but you do need to know about how, in a field about which you knew nothing before, you can reach an intelligent conclusion by using logic, using the noddle. What is logic? It's the structured use of reason. And so I showed them these graphs, and they could all see at once which was right and which was wrong. And it's a shame I can't display it to you here, but it's terribly, terribly clear. And the director of the school was really fascinated. He slipped out of the room and came back clutching something. At the end of the lecture, he went up to the platform, and he said, gentlemen, I was fascinated that Lord Monckton didn't simply give us a lecture about climate change. He gave us a lecture about how to evaluate evidence in a field with which one is familiar. That, of course, is the central problem for every intelligence officer, as he knows and as you are all beginning to know. And because he has shown you a very nice series of examples of how this is done, of how you can use logic, and even if you're not an expert in the field, you can show the experts in the field that some of them have got it wrong. I am going to award him the Intelligence Medal of the Army of Colombia, and I was given this bling factor 5 medal on the mantle. And when I got back, I was deputy leader of UKIP at the time. I got back to Edinburgh, and the chairman of UKIP came to see me in Scotland, and I showed him, with some pride, this enormous medal. And he said, Intelligence Medal of the Army of Colombia. Intelligence? You? So that cut me back down to size again.
Great stuff. Lord Monckton, maybe we could turn our attention to the implications of all of this sort of, I like the way you refer to it as the climate communists, because it's a political agenda, isn't it? We know by the use of the word consensus, amongst other things, that we're dealing in a sphere of politics and not science. Yeah. So we've got the Paris Accord, obviously, a few years ago, which all these nations are signing up to ban fossil fuels. You've got the Green New Deal in the States, and the implications of where this is going seem to not be considered at all, because as any intelligent person would know, and rationally looking at it, our wealth creation, our prosperity is directly proportional to the availability of abundant cheap energy. So if we eradicate fossil fuels as we're being appealed to do by these treaties, and we rely on the unreliables, as Alex Epstein calls them. So that when the sun goes down and the wind stops blowing, you haven't got any energy at all. The implications of these treaties, the implications of where this is going, is a massive contraction of economic activity and therefore prosperity. I mean, would you agree with that? I'm fascinated to hear that you're a logician as well.
That is the purpose of the exercise.
Well, one has to infer that, doesn't you? I mean, it can't be anything else.
I actually give you, now that the 30-year rule is gone, I can give you some of the background to where this all came from. It came from the Disinformation Directorate of the KGB. And I better give you a bit of a history of that directorate. It was founded in 1945, 1 month after the Allies had, as it now turns out unwisely, allowed the Russians the honor of taking Berlin in recognition of Marshal Zhukov's admittedly very gallant defense of Stalingrad and defeat of Hitler on the Eastern Front. And this was a very characteristically nice thing that we did. They would never have done it for us, but we did it for them, and we let them invade. And the one ministry building of the Third Reich that was still standing was, as luck would have it, the Reich's propaganda ministry of Joseph Goebbels, which was at that time the largest office building in the whole of Western Europe, and only one wing of it had got bombed. But all the records were in the wing that remained. And because Goebbels had believed his own propaganda, that he couldn't think that the Tausendjährige Reich would come crashing around their ears in a few weeks, he had ordered all his civil servants, on pain of execution, they were not to destroy any of the records. So the Russians got the lot. And in those records, they found the answer to the big question that every historian looking at the emergence of Nazism must ask, which is how could one of the most civilized nations in Europe, and indeed in the world, have been turned in only a few years into a nation of monsters, so as to allow the Nazi Party to emerge and take control? How did the Nazis do this? And they discovered that Goebbels had a system by which every new member of the Nazi Party that could be signed up was immediately trained in looking out for anyone anywhere who was being successful in attacking Nazism and exposing its failings. And they were trained in how to trash the personal reputations of all who opposed the Nazi Party line.
Right.
And they did this ruthlessly. And after a few years of doing this was kind of in the 1920s, the effect was that everyone who might otherwise have said, look at these goons and thugs going around recommending the Jews should be executed and so on, how can we possibly give them the time of day? Instead of saying that, people one by one, all their opponents, fell silent because they didn't want to be falsely accused of sexual peccadilloes. You'll see it happen to Trump now. They didn't want to be accused of this, that, and the other. They didn't want their reputations trashed. The Germans have a saying, Geld verloren, nichts verloren, Mut verloren, alles verloren, which means you can lose all your money, you've lost nothing. You lose your reputation, you've lost everything. And the Nazis played on this, and they attacked and attacked and attacked. Everyone who popped up and attacked Nazism, they were made out to be a pedophile, homosexuals, sleeping with other people's wives, whatever they can admit. Usually it was sexual, but not always. And by this means, they terrified everybody who wasn't a Nazi into silence. So they had a completely free ride. And that was how they did it. Now, the moment the Russians found this out, they said, well, we don't need to do that in Russia as they needed to in Germany because we're already in control. Anybody who disagrees with us, we can kill them. But we are international socialists, not like the national socialists. You know, we're all totalitarians of the same stamp, but we want to spread totalitarianism worldwide by convincing people. And so what did they do? They set up a disinformation directorate whose primary task was to recruit willing unpaid Western communists to look out for opportunities to trash the reputations of all who were proving effective in opposing communism outside Russia, and particularly in America and in Britain.
Wow.
Those were their two major targets, because they knew that if you've got America and Britain subdued, the rest of the world would follow. And they put a man in charge of it, whom I know. He is Ion Mihai Pacepa. And he was at the time the head of the Securitate, which was the secret police in Ceausescu's Romania. And he was then given this extra job of setting up the disinformation directorate to recruit these Western communists. And so the way he did it was he started recruiting them, and he found it was really easy, because he said there were far more, there were believing communists in the West. We don't have any believing communists in Russia. Nobody believes in communism in Russia or in the Soviet bloc. Only in the West do you find people idiotic enough to believe this, because they don't really see just how terrible it all is in places like Russia. So he said there were so many believing communists that he had no difficulty recruiting them. So when he came out to the West in 1978 as one of the most senior defectors ever to come across, and he came out because he could see the damage that he was doing to the entire fabric of the world by this business of trashing people's reputations, so that the left was prevailing everywhere, and the libertarians, in whom he in the end came to believe, were being stamped out. He came to the West and he had a fit of conscience, and he told us everything. And so when he said he had done this, the next question was, okay, well, how many willing Western communists did you recruit? So he sat there, and he's a dumpy man with these very, very pebble spectacles and a pasty-faced Eastern European face, terrible crumpled East German suit. You wouldn't look at him twice on the bus. He's one of the cleverest people I ever came across. So we said, okay, so how many people did you recruit in 33 years as head of this directorate? He looked at us, he just said, 1 million. And we said, what?
Wow.
1 million. And we said, come off it, mate. Everybody who defects tries to big up their importance in the regime. We think that's what you're doing. So come on, tell us really how many it was. It was 1 million, he said. And we said, but how could you control 1 million agents on a shoestring budget? You didn't even pay them. How on earth did you do that? He said, the first thing was they were believing communists, and there are an awful lot of them in the West, he said. Yeah. And secondly, he said, once we had recruited the first few, we realized how easy it was to recruit them. We simply told them to recruit their successors, but not to actually recruit them until they told us who they were recruiting, so that we could make sure that they didn't recruit anybody who we knew to be working for the other side, and they didn't also recruit anybody we'd recruited already. Right. So he said that was the only rule. So the only thing we actually had to do from then on was to sit back and take the names. He said it ran itself. Right. And that's how we did it. And after all, we weren't requiring them to do rocket science. All we were saying is, get into the local newspaper, start accusing Donald Trump of sexual peccadillos. And if they're true, so much the better, because that will work. And if they're not true, make it up anyway. And so that's what they began doing. And they've been doing it ever since. They began doing it to me the moment I popped my head over the parapet in 2006 in a big article in the Sunday Telegraph, our major national newspaper over here, and said, actually, global warming doesn't add up. The logic isn't there. It's not working for me. And immediately, these attacks by communists, and I knew they were communists, on me began. They've gone on ever since. And everybody who takes the anti-communist party line on the climate is subjected to the same miserable treatment. Yeah. And so he said to us, Pacepa, he said, this is going to carry on. So then we got into things like, obviously, the miners' strike in Britain, which was an attack on our energy supplies, because, as you rightly said in introducing this particular segment, the big question that we have is how can we keep affordable energy, because that's the mainspring of all Western economic activity. It was we in Britain who first realized you could use coal because of its energy density to power machines that could drive factories and locomotives. And then came oil, and then came gas. And this is now what fuels the economy in the literal sense. So, of course, this is crucial. Now, the communists knew they couldn't compete with the West economically. They simply can't do it. So they, instead of trying to level up the West standards, they tried to bring the West down to their standards. So they were heavily involved in the Labour Party, and to some extent still are, heavily involved in the environmental movement, particularly since the Berlin Wall came down. Patrick Moore was a good friend of mine, a founder of Greenpeace, told me that he and many of the other founders who weren't communists but were genuine environmentalists all had to leave because the communists didn't want them there and they pushed them out when they took over. But the miners' strike was run from Moscow. And Arthur Scargill, I can tell you this now, I give you the times and dates and places so you'll realize that I'm not just an anti-communist staring-eyed lunatic. On the 28th of July 1979, just 3 months after Margaret Thatcher had taken office, Arthur Scargill, who was the leader of the National Union of Mine Workers at the time, he was an out-and-out communist, and I knew him well because I had been in Yorkshire and had drunk with him at Whitelock's pub in Leeds. He was very companionable. His politics stank, and he hated Britain and the West. And so he took a Polish freighter from Tilbury to what was still then Leningrad, and like Lenin before him, a sealed train from there to Moscow, where he was met, and he was taken to the Patrice Lumumba University of Terrorism, where he spent 3 weeks. They realized he was a cut above the grunts who go around blowing themselves up all over the Arab world and who fly planes into buildings and do all that sort of. All of these people were trained at the Patrice Lumumba University. So instead, they transferred him to the Lenin Institute, which is where the senior terrorists, the Yasser Arafats of this world, and a couple of big names I could mention in this country but won't, they were trained there. And he spent 5 months being trained there in the higher techniques of disruption. And he then came on, in December of 1979, he came back on an Aeroflot flight from Moscow to Paris, changed planes, and then went from Paris to London on a British Airways flight so that he hoped we wouldn't see what he was doing, and when he arrived in London, nobody would realize he'd been to Russia and was landing from a Russian flight. So that's how it was done. But of course, we had people with him all the way there, all the way at both institutes, and all the way back. So we knew exactly what he'd done. So the question arose when eventually the miners' strike happened, a couple of years after that, should the people be told, and if so, how? And by that stage, I was working inside 10 Downing Street, officially as a policy advisor. Unofficially, I was doing a certain amount of, let us call it, informal counterintelligence on the question of how to deal with the miners' strike. And you say not too much more about it than that. But one of the things that had to be decided, and this was decided well above my pay grade, and let me make that clear, I was a very junior cog in the wheel, was should we tell the people, and if so, how, about Scargill's connections with Moscow, about the fact that Moscow was also funding the miners' strike. We managed to trace just one transaction with 20 million came through the Czechoslovak embassy into the miners' funds. And so should we tell the people this? Or was that not fair game? And the main consideration was 150 agents would have to be let go if we told the people, because otherwise they would be compromised, because the Russians would work out what we knew. So we had to get them all out, because it was decided that that we should tell people. So then the question was how to tell them. And we thought, the miners read the Daily Mirror, maybe a few of them read the Sun, because there are quite a few miners who were conservatives. About a third of the miners were conservatives, so they found it expedient in those days not to say so. But you often find it on the doorsteps canvassing them. And so it was decided in the end that a column, very unspectacular, should be buried down the gutter of the Times by a trusted columnist who was not of any great fame or reputation, but he was reliable and solid. So he wrote a piece giving all the facts and figures that I've just given. And then the question was, how could we get this into the hands of the miners? The problem was that if we put it in the Daily Mirror, they would have read it, but they wouldn't believe the Daily Mirror. Nobody believes the Daily Mirror. But if we put it in the Times, they would believe it, but they wouldn't read it. So that was the more talk we were on. So the question, how could we then get it into the hands of the miners? So I said, I think I have a way. So I took the cuttings and I went on my motorbike up to a country house somewhere in England, which was belonged to a friend of the Prime Minister's, who was a man called David Hart, who was very active in the sort of right wing of conservative politics, sensible right wing, not the silly right wing. And I said to him, we need these cuttings got into the hands of every miner in Britain. Will you please drop what you're doing. He was mowing the grass on his front lawn at the time with a tractor. It was that big a lawn. And I said, get into that new Merc you've just bought and go and visit every pit in Britain. I want you to talk to the miners in every pit, get to know them. He was the sort that could do this, because a lot of people in the Conservative Party had no idea how to talk to working people. He could do this, and I knew he could. So I said, I want you to go and do this and take these cuttings and make sure that the miners spread it around among themselves so that they all know that their loyalty, because they're very loyal, the miners, their loyalty to their union is in this instance misplaced because their union is acting as an agent of a foreign power. And the great thing about the miners, they weren't just loyal to each other, because you have to be below ground. It's a very, very dangerous place to work. And they were loyal to their union for the same reason. But above all else, they were loyal to their country. These were not communists. Very, very few of them were communists. Yeah. These were the most profoundly loyal people. So David Hart went round all the pits over the next few months. He spoke to just about every miner he could. He identified that the Leicestershire miners were weakening first, and then the Nottinghamshire ones. He set up and paid for out of his own pocket the National Working Miners Committee. He then took out a series of, it cost him millions, advertisements in the newspapers to say, come on, Arthur, give us a ballot, which eventually worked, and Scargill had to give him a ballot, and that broke the strike. And he ran the whole thing from his suite at Claridge's. And eventually, the Department of Trade and Industry, whose minister was at that time unreliable and would not have known how to manage the strike like this, found out that the strike was actually being run by this counterintelligence operation from a suite in Claridge's. So he rang Claridge's and said, I want to be put through to this operation. So he was put through to David, who took the call. And so the minister yelled down the phone, you can't run this strike from Claridge's. Oh, no, said David, of course, it's not for me to be running the strike at all. You'd probably like to speak to the man who does. And that is, of course, Ian McGregor, the chairman of the National Coal Board. Shall I hand you over to him? He's just here now. That was the last we heard from the ministry. So we got on with it. And it was really David Hart who pretty much broke the strike.
But it's the one thing I didn't understand. I mean, I was just a young chap back then. Yeah. But one thing I don't understand is that keeping coal going. We know now that it's a credible energy source, provided you can clean burn it without pollution, which we can absolutely. Yeah. So our coal industry. Nothing wrong with it, but my understanding was that Margaret Thatcher there was a policy of getting rid of that coal industry. And how does that fit in with these communists? Let's wrap
up the communist end of this, and then we'll go on to Margaret Thatcher, because that was the next thing that happened. Was global warming came along. So the strike was broken. And that was one of the major factors leading to the demise of Soviet communism, because this was a big failure. They were really hoping to get rid of Margaret Thatcher because they knew how dangerous she was to their entire effort to spread communism worldwide. And they failed. And that led to enormous internal soul searching inside communist Russia. But it also meant that they hadn't been able to succeed in making our energy more expensive, which was the real aim of this, so that they would put our economy at a permanent disadvantage against Russia, which had masses of coal and could very easily, through Poland, they could very easily generate electricity dirt cheap. So that was what was in it for the communists. It was to make our energy more expensive, and therefore already they had cheaper labor. Of course, they didn't provide social care, they didn't provide pensions, they didn't provide proper health care, and of course the wages were terrible. So they could undercut us in that way. But if they could also undercut us in energy costs, then in the end all heavy industries in the West were just going to close down. So they didn't succeed then, so they tried again. Pachepa's people then moved in and took over the environmental movement. So I heard it from his end, but of course also I heard it from Patrick Moore, who was at that stage a leading light in Greenpeace. He'd been one of its founders. And he suddenly noticed all these communists were piling into the organization and taking it over. And he eventually left. Yeah. And now they've literally done the communist technique of airbrushing him out of the photos, the group photos of the founders of Greenpeace, because they so hate the fact that a genuine environmentalist who isn't a communist it's recognized that the communists had moved in and taken over Greenpeace. So all you people out there who may be giving money to Greenpeace because you think you're going to save the planet, all you're going to do is to trash the Western economies, and you won't save the planet, but you will further the causes of communism. That's what it's really all about. So when Margaret Thatcher then looked at what we were going to do about the miners, this global warming story in 1988 started to emerge, only a few years after the end of the miners' strike. That's how quickly the communists got their boots on. And they had managed to get a few key papers planted saying we're going to fry if we have more global warming, etc., etc. And then James Hansen was absolutely crucial to this because he was very much that way inclined politically. So he was brought in on the act, and he then began writing some catastrophically stupid papers. And it was he who, for instance, who first made this egregious error of assuming that temperature feedback can only react to the changes in temperature you get from the greenhouse gases and didn't also react to the sunshine. So you could take all the feedback response to the sunshine, add it to the feedback response from the greenhouse gases, and then, hey, you've got a crisis. That's how he did it. And you can read his paper of 1984. You'll see how carefully constructed it is to do exactly this. And you've got two choices. Either he was doing it deliberately or he was doing it accidentally. But either way, he was doing it effectively because the Democrats in the United States, even at that stage, were very much under the control of Russian communism, under the influence of Russian communism. And so they then picked up this thing, working Al Gore and Senator Tim Wirth and James Hansen, all working together to force this agenda onto the American list. Then you had another communist living in China. He was Maurice Strong, and he then did the UN side of it and got the UN involved, because always the communists will look for centers of power that they can move in on and take over and reconstruct in their own image. And the UN was a classic center of power, so they got in there very early on. So the idea was they would try to fool the West into subverting itself internally by being persuaded that global warming was a real problem. And they had control of the media. The BBC, for instance, was substantially Marxist. Even when I was at Cambridge, a friend of mine went down there to ask for a job. He was a Marxist. He came back looking like the cat that got the cream. I said, oh, so they asked you the question, you gave them the answer, and they gave you the job. He said, how did you know the interview was that short? I said, never mind how I know, but we are watching, I said, which guilt off the gingerbread for him. The question, of course, was, are you a Marxist? And the answer in his case was yes, and they gave him the job just on the strength of that. That's how it was, and to a very large extent still is done at the BBC. This is an organisation deeply inimical to Britain and to Western interests, and it's time we just abolished it, frankly. So then this began to work, and I began thinking, oh my God, this is looking terrible with global warming. We have to look at this. And so I did a few notes for Margaret Thatcher saying we're going to have to look out for this, but I can't yet make out who's telling the truth on it. And then I left in about 1986, and my successor, giving her scientific advice, who was no more a scientist than I was a guy called George Guise, who was much more readily fooled by all this at that stage than I was. I became more readily fooled by it later, but hadn't been at that stage. And he wrote a remarkably stupid speech for Margaret Thatcher in 1988, which I think she gave at the UN, in which she said there's going to be 1 Celsius of global warming per decade unless we stop burning fossil fuels. Oh. So that was his doing, and that's how it came about. But then, and I was writing by that stage articles in the Standard saying, well, I bought a house on Richmond Hill, the rest of you have to take the boats because London's going to be underwater, etc., etc. And then in 2006, of course, I was asked actually to check the science and immediately found the whole thing was nonsense. But in the 1980s and 1990s, this was being pushed and pushed and pushed by the communists really, really strongly. And of course, even after the Berlin Wall came down, it was still in Russia's interest to promote the idea that global warming was terrible so that we wouldn't do fracking. And because they already knew about fracking, we've been doing it in this country on a small scale for 60 years. So Russia, even after communism, is now paying the anti-fracking groups in this country to oppose fracking, because under Blackpool is one of the largest sources of frackable gas in the world. And we're not being able to extract it because the left are being paid by Moscow. It's no longer communist Moscow. It's straightforward nationalist Moscow saying we want to sell the gas into our good friends, the commissars of the European Union. And indeed, commissar is the official German name for the commissioners who have total power in the European Union. The European Parliament can't even bring forward a bill unless the commissars put it in front of them. So the commissars are directly benefiting the rebuilding of Russia by paying far more for natural gas than the world price. And so Russia has that vested interest in maintaining not just the anti-fracking groups, but also the Greenpeace and all the other Extinction Rebellion, all these other outfits who are promoting the collapse of Western civilization by the destruction of our energy supplies. And then you also have China, which has a different motive. And China is a particularly interesting question because I briefed the Chinese leadership very quietly on this just before the Copenhagen conference. And I went from Hong Kong into Shenzhen and a little golf course resort there. All sorts of people from the Chinese leadership came. And I said, right, here is the real science. And they were fascinated. And so Wen Jiabao, who was then the State Council president, was not really a communist. He was softening the communist line and was realizing that a lot of the communists in the West were going to do damage to China by insisting on this global warming stuff, which had originated in Russia, of course. So he then, when he went to the Copenhagen climate conference, and Obama said to him at a private meeting, they had a 55-minute private meeting there, he said, Obama said, look, we're all communists together. Can't you just toe the Communist Party line on the climate, and we can bring the West down together? Wen Jiabao said, I don't think you understand. He said, we're not that kind of destructive communists. We don't do that anymore, not in China. He said, I don't have that kind of outlook. No, we don't want to destroy the West. That's not part of our game plan, and I won't do it. And he flounced out quite angry from the meeting with Obama. He was insulted that anyone could think that he, who was a very enlightened and civilized man in many ways, could possibly just go along with some Moscow Communist Party line, which is what Obama was towing, of course. So he then went into the conference chamber, having had this side meeting with Obama, went straight onto the stage, demanded the right to speak, and said that China wasn't playing, he was vetoing the whole thing. And I was the only non-negotiating delegate to be in there because the left staged a demonstration so as to get the non-negotiating delegates banned. And I'll just stop this, I'm sorry. And so we were all thrown out, but I got back in again by getting myself attached to the US delegation as the advisor to a congressman. So he ordered them to let me back in. And I watched as Wen Jiabao went on stage and shot down the Copenhagen Climate Treaty. And it's just as well that he did, because that treaty was going to establish a world government based on the UN. Gosh. So it was really very, very drastic.
So there's this whole connection then. Sorry to jump in there, Lord Monckton, but there's this whole connection then with a political agenda. As you said, communism simply can't, by definition of what it is, with lack of property rights, a lack of freedom, it can't generate the wealth to compete with the West because of the nature of the thing. So the only thing it can do is keep the West down. So you're suggesting, or you're quite clearly illustrating here a picture of a much broader political agenda, which is ongoing and aims to bring down our economy, which is obviously what would happen if we were to reduce it.
It is working, you see, because the cost of energy in Britain now is 6 times what it would be were it not global warming policy, because the raw materials that you make this energy out of, the oil, the coal and the gas, they've halved in price. Oil's down by 2/3 in price. And of course, the cost of running the power station has gone down as well because of technology. So we should be paying only 1/6 of what we are paying for energy. That every big business has had to go. The last aluminium smelter went 3 years ago. The last steelworks up in Scunthorpe, that's just gone. And the motor manufacturers, one by one, are moving out. Everybody who depends on energy-intensive industry is having to leave the United Kingdom because we are showing leadership in backing this communist policy of destroying our own economy. That was always the aim of Pacheco and his people right from the start, to get us to subvert ourselves by being misled into believing all this nonsense. But the present Chinese leadership is different. under Xi Jinping, he is a real communist of the old-fashioned kind. He hates the West, is determined to dominate it, and the big pressure on China under him is to get enough natural resources to fuel the expansion of infrastructure, which is their way of trying to level up with the West.
Do you mean the Silk Road and all this sort of stuff?
The infrastructure projects in China are immense, and
but even the plans to bring this infrastructure, right, trans-Eurasian continent. Yeah.
All of that is part of it. They've got a huge, first of all, internal transport infrastructure. High-speed rail goes all the way up to Tibet now. Of course, they captured Tibet and they still occupy it, which they shouldn't, because of the mineral resources there. Their big problem is mineral resources. And so in order to fuel their expansion, they have to get more mineral resources. So what they don't want to do is to have to pay the sort of prices they would have to pay to compete with the West if the Western economies were roaring away to the extent that they would be if our energy costs were 1/6 of what they are. So they, under Xi Jinping, have realized that what they need to do is to promote this climate nonsense externally, pretend to promote it internally so as to fool the Western people into saying all the communists are wonderful, which Christina Figuehead, who ran the UN's climate panel for a time, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change for a time, she said, of course, communist China is the model for this.
But aren't the communists, sorry to interrupt again, but isn't China, one of the biggest CO2 emitters? Doesn't that sort of fly in the face of it?
Per head, no, but in absolute terms, it will soon, in the next 10 years, emit more than half of all the world's CO2. And yet, the Pope's advisor on this, who is a very sinister communist, called Marcelo Sanchez Sorondo, who is the prefect of the Pontifical Academy both of Sciences and of Social Sciences, he has actually said that China is the model for the world in how to deal with global warming. That's how far things have gone. They've at last the communists have managed to move in and take over the Vatican, which was their biggest enemy under Pacheco. His first target was Pope Pius XII, and they falsely made him out to be a Nazi-loving Jew hater. That was the way they got at him. And now the Vatican is the big ally of the communists, because they're getting in absolutely everywhere. Because since the Berlin Wall came down, nobody saw them as a threat anymore. And so going to the schools and the universities, they're wall-to-wall communists now. It's astonishing the degree to which this communist way of thinking has taken over completely, and largely invisibly, so that most people don't know it's happening. Even now, my lovely wife will say to me, you mustn't use this word communist, it makes you seem extreme. Well, guess who invented the phrase Reds under the beds? That was Pacheco again. And they wanted to make it look as though there was nothing going on, when in fact, of course, there was a lot going on. That still, unfortunately, remains the case. No longer run by Russian communists, it is run by Russian nationalists and Chinese communists. And of course, as always, by the far larger number of believing communists in the West. And so yes, this is the geopolitics of it.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because last century it was Rand who pointed out that the fundamental philosophical premises held by a nation, a civilization, are really what drive it, and altruism really is the ethics of communism, isn't it? And of course altruism is widespread from religions, and it's just I was
communism
with it.
To whatever argument it can use, and it pretends that communism is altruistic. Communism is far from altruistic. It is anything but. It is never do you get such concentrations of power and wealth in the hands of the few, and misery.
But it's hiding behind altruism. That's the point. My point is that the power is there, but the story is sold that it's for everyone. It's for the collective benefit. It holds up this this big screen of altruism, which is the moral justification for communism. And this,
moral justification. Let's be very clear. Don't call it altruism. It is a manufactured appearance of altruism, so that they can fool particularly young people who are ideological into going along with it because they think they're saving their planet. Well, the planet was triumphantly saved 2,000 years ago, and it doesn't need to be saved again. Greta Thunberg et al., please note. So we must be very careful of our language. If we start calling them altruistic, that sounds like a good thing, and they're not altruistic. They are using the appearance of altruism as a way of fooling us into letting our guard down. And this works particularly well with young people who are very easily taken in by communism. So this has had a very terrible effect on the West, because most of our major institutions now are under the control of Pacepa's people, effectively, or their successors, because of course he's been long out of it. And even though there is no longer a directing mind in Russia driving the communist movement worldwide, there were so many Pacepa communists teaching the West's left how to trash the reputations of their opponents. You'll find this in Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, for instance. Exactly the same techniques are all set out there. This is now deeply ingrained in the left. They know how to do it instinctively. They no longer need to be trained or recruited to do it. So it's no longer a giant conspiracy run from Moscow, as it was. It is no longer. Now, the Western communists who still actually believe this nonsense will do this simply because they hate their own countries and they hate what they call capitalism, what we call free market enterprise, so very much.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, for capitalism, free market enterprise is the system of freedom. I see it's respect for individualism, property rights, and all that. But one of the central tenets of altruism is that man doesn't have the right to live for his own sake. He's there as his brother's keeper, and this is an underpinning philosophical justification, a moral justification for socialism, which, of course, we know leads to communism. Socialism is just the top of the slippery slope, but communism sits on all of the despotic leaders. It's this altruism is a marvelous excuse, a justification. It's a moral justification for all of the despots that sit on that power.
Pseudo moral. It is anti-moral because it's a lie, and it's not a justification. It's a fig leaf. Don't even use words like that because they'll distort them. We have to make it plain that we understand that what they are doing is at root dishonest.
Yes.
It is of the devil, because the devil is the father of lies, and these people are liars.
Yes.
And the idea that the policies they are advocating are altruistic is a lie, and it must be very plainly stated to be a lie.
Yes, that's true.
Not altruistic.
So are you optimistic ultimately, Lord Monckton? Do you obviously we've covered a lot of ground here. Looking back on all we've said, bearing all that in mind, are you optimistic? How do you see things panning out? Will truth prevail?
Well, the truth has a way of finding its way through eventually, despite all the politicians wanting to stop it. I mean, the fact that Boris Johnson believes in this climate nonsense when he really ought to have enough intellect to realise it's rubbish is a poor sign. The fact that even the Brexit party is now telling its people to toe the line and go along with this climate crap is quite extraordinary. I'm glad to say I met UKIP's leader the other day. They have not bought into this and are not going to. But most of the political parties now have bought this rubbish. So politically, I don't think this is easy to defeat. And that is why what I have done with my team is to concentrate on the science, which is where we started.
Yes.
And these very simple, very obvious errors. You define the sunshine temperature as being the temperature in the absence of any greenhouse gases, but then you go and calculate on the basis that there are clouds in the atmosphere. Any fool can see that that is a contradiction and that therefore that's wrong. Likewise, any fool can see that if 8 Celsius of warming from greenhouse gases can cause 24 Celsius of feedback response, then you can't get away with trying to pretend, as official climatology does today, that 255 Celsius, Kelvin rather, will suddenly cause 0 Kelvin of feedback response. That is obviously in your face impossible. And the arithmetic underlying it is arithmetic that a kid of 12 can understand. And that's what we've been working towards. It's finding a simple enough way of showing that this is just propaganda and that they've got the science really, really badly wrong.
Yeah.
And we think we've now done it. And we're now just beginning to put up little postings and videos and things here and there explaining these things and explaining them so that ordinary folk who don't have any scientific knowledge can understand that we are more or less bound to be right. And more importantly, so that when they go to, when the media go to their favourite communist scientists, they're only a small number, but they completely dominate the debate. They're very good at knowing how to do that. And they ask, how do we defeat Monckton, who says he's found these really simple errors? And the communist scientists are going to find they cannot find any plausible argument against what we're making. And so then it's going to be all over from then on. It's going to take time. We're going to have to probably struggle for another year or two before we will eventually get this published in a peer-reviewed journal. But in the meantime, we're gradually educating the skeptics in these arguments so that they begin to understand just how wrong and how elementary the mistakes are, how obvious the mistakes are, so that eventually when the press, who are to a very large extent dominated by communists, eventually realize they just can't go on looking even halfway credible by banging on any longer about global warming, because it's transparently not going to warm at anything like the rate they predicted. And that therefore we actually not only don't have a climate emergency, the correct policy stance is to have the courage to face down the screeching communists and just do nothing.
Yes.
And just end it, because I'm due at another interview now.
Absolutely. So just to wrap up then, I mean, yes, I mean, obviously the truth will out, because, you know, if the climate doesn't change catastrophically, we'll all live to see the results. And of course, the scary predictions and models that haven't come true, the fact that the Earth's been greening over the last 30 years, all of these things actually serve to you know, show people the facts of reality that we live in are going to fly in the face of the official story. So, well, look, thank you so much for your time, Lord Monckton. Really appreciate that you're sharing all your knowledge and wisdom there. So, many thanks to you. Is there anything you'd like to say in closing as to what people could do, or anything sort of just a positive note to end on?
First of all, go to whatsupwiththat.com, WATTS, upwiththat.com. And from time to time, I post things there. That's where I'll be giving further details as we unfold them of what we're discovering. And where, if we do find that the Connellys have got their research right, we'll talk more about that as well. We'll talk more about Professor Frank's result, which is causing consternation among the modelers, because they're all terrified because they don't understand propagation of uncertainty in statistics. And so all of these areas outside climate science, which have a direct bearing on what the climatologists are doing. And the communists didn't think of that. They thought they could just command climate science, control that, shut the debate down. They suddenly find that they've made the subject so big that it spills over into all these other important areas. And if they're wrong in those important areas, they're wrong in climate science as well. And that's the approach we're taking. We are going to, as Matt Damon puts it in The Martian when he's stranded on the planet, has to work out how to save his life. We're going to have to science the shit out of it. That's what we're doing. And by that way, if we are correct, and we are doing our best to try to attain the truth rather than pushing any party line, political, scientific or other, if we are correct, eventually, whether they like it or not, the truth will prevail. It always does. As one of the Apocryphal Gospels put it, magna est veritas et prevalet. Great is truth and mighty above all things.
Great stuff. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Lord Monckton, and thank you all for listening. I'd urge you to visit the website lawfulrebel.com for more on this, and I'll certainly be keeping up to date, Lord Monckton, with any findings or publications. Please do let us know, and I shall do my best to disseminate the truth. So thank you very much indeed.
Many thanks.